We've been talking about how Congress managed to pay for the war. And as I said, they did manage to borrow lots of money from wealthy Americans who loaned it because they believed in the cause. There were people who had money, and even though these loans are meaningless, I mean, it's stupid to borrow money or to lend money under those circumstances. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. No intelligent person would lend money to a borrower who is going to lose a war and not ever be able to pay you back. And the worst part of it is that that in fact, if you lend a lot of money and you're a major supporter of the whole independence cause, the Brits can look on you as a traitor and they can kill you. Americans use the phrase, we sacrifice our lives, our fortunes, and our honor. This is not just a phrase. This is serious stuff. These guys really went out and did it. If we lose that war, and as I said earlier, every logical analysis says we are going to lose. If we lose this war, they're going to be executed. Their property will be confiscated so that their families will be left in poverty. And their honor, in terms of the role that they'll play in history, will be that of traitors, of people who just simply rebelled against His Majesty the King, and they tried to destroy it, they were crushed totally. So that's what you're up against. But people did it. People did it. Congress also borrowed money from other sources. They went to other countries and they borrowed money. And again, amazingly, they found people in other countries who were willing to lend money to the United States. Now, the biggest lender to the United States was, not surprisingly, France. And France was only willing to lend money to the United States because they wanted to hurt England. They didn't really care about us. They wanted to hurt England. And so France loaned us a lot of money. They helped us in other ways. They recognized us as a nation, and I've been trying to say we're not exactly a nation. We don't have a real government. Sort of yes, sort of no. So it's a question of whether you call ourselves a nation. But they recognized us as one. They signed a treaty with us, and they sent over a lot of troops to help us. So aid from France was very, very valuable in the war. I started to say winning the war. We didn't exactly win it, but in not losing it, France played a key role in making that possible, both with money, with troops, with equipment, with supplies, and with training. The French officers came over and helped train the Continental Army. George Washington was a very bright guy and a very capable guy, but frankly he was an amateur, and he really wasn't as qualified to serve as the leader as some of the French people who helped him. So he wouldn't have been able to do as well as he did without the help of French advisors. So France helped us a lot. We also borrowed money from Spain. We borrowed money from some Dutch bankers. There was a time there when the war was looking really, really bad, and the army was just out of money and things looked really bleak. And then our representatives to the Netherlands talked to some bankers there and managed to scrounge up a loan that sort of got us over the hump there. We actually got help from people in North Africa, which is a little bit weird, but the key there is that North Africans controlled trade of the Mediterranean, and since we were not trading with England anymore, of course our trade with England, which has always been our biggest trading partner, that's gone, obviously, but we were able to pick up for it a little bit by expanding our trade to the Mediterranean, and we needed help from the North Africans to do that. So we got help from various places. And actually, if you look at the numbers, is pretty close to 50-50. Half of the money that Congress borrowed came from Americans, half came from foreigners. So that was a big plus. And when we start talking about borrowing money from foreigners, we established diplomatic relations with foreign countries. We sent ambassadors to France to be our representatives, our official, formal, legal representatives. Ambassador is a term from the United States to France. It changed a little bit over time. We had different people doing it. Some of the names that you may hear are pretty famous. Ben Franklin was for a long time was our ambassador to France. He was joined by John Adams, and you know that name. And then later, Thomas Jefferson came over and worked out, and Franklin went on to the Netherlands and so forth. That we're establishing formal relations with other governments. Well, who does that? The government. So there's Congress. Maybe it's not a government, but it's sure doing what governments do. It's sending official ambassadors to other countries. We are signing treaties with them. Only countries sign treaties, only nations sign treaties. And we're borrowing money from them. So Congress managed foreign policy. It acted as our official representative to foreign countries. And that was a big plus for us. So that was another thing Congress did. Another thing Congress did was finally to make the decision to declare independence. Now that was a tough decision to make. As I told you, Americans had tremendous loyalty to the king. We felt ourselves to be British subjects. And we are very conscious of having the rights, the liberty that we identified as part of being a British subject. British subjects have rights, we have liberty that nobody else has. And we're very conscious of that, and we have a great deal of loyalty for our king and love of the king. Parliament, well, we don't care about Parliament, but, and we don't pay any attention to Parliament. But we think of ourselves as subjects of the king, of His Royal Majesty, King George III. And to cut that off is a very hard thing to do. Americans are very reluctant to do that. We don't like the taxes that Parliament is imposing, but let's not blame the king for that. And as I told you, the Stamp Act resolves were addressed to the king. Americans asked the king to intervene and protect us against Parliament. So if you're going to think about being independent of the king, that's a big deal. That's a hard thing to do. In the early days of the war, Washington used to meet with his staff, with his generals, his other top generals. They'd have a formal meal together. This was part of the routine of being a general of the militias and so forth. And the officers would do what they had always done at the officers' mess, as it's called, the meal that they ate together. They would start it off with a toast, and they would drink a toast to the health of the king. And the American Continental Army and its leadership was doing that even after they're fighting a war against the king's soldiers. So we're still real close to being loyal to the king. And many Americans remain that way through the entire war. We don't have a good feel for what the breakdown of support for the war was. We just make some estimates. And a common number that we use, and we only use it because it's sort of convenient, and because we don't have any facts, we don't really know what people think. But we believe that maybe a third of the people supported independence. A third didn't really care one way or the other. But another third remained loyal to the king. And they were called the Loyalists. You may also have heard a term that's used for them, the Tories. The Tories, and a third of the people remained loyalists. So Congress is faced with the situation there. They're fighting this war against England, and they don't know what public opinion is. They don't know if the American public approves of what they're doing or not. Now, one of the things that kind of helped turn the tide of public opinion, we think, turn the tide of public opinion against the king in favor of independence, was the publication in January of 1776. Remember, by this time the war's been going on for about 8 months. In January of 1776, an Englishman, actually a recent immigrant to America, an immigrant who had come there because of his radical ideas in England were too radical for there. His name was Thomas Paine, and he wrote a little booklet called Common Sense. And we know that it was widely read by the Americans. We know people were talking about it. People were writing in their diaries about that they had just read Common Sense and they'd really been inspired by it. We have some original copies of the document that are in libraries and museums and archives and so forth. And the ones that are still around, the originals, this is, a special thing, it's one of the originals. And most of them are in really bad shape. They're beat up, they're dirty, indicating that they've been handed around from person to person. A lot of people have read it. So we can't really judge things, but we do have evidence to prove that at least a lot of people knew about Thomas Paine, and they knew about Common Sense. And what he said in there was, forget about loyalty to the king. The only thing for you to do is to become independent. That's the only way we can go. We are a nation. We have to stop acting like colonies of England. We have to stop acting like being under the control of the king, and we have to break away from the king and become independent. So the leaders of Congress knew that that booklet was out there, and they knew that people were reading it, and they were talking about it, and they knew that maybe things are going their way, so they said, okay, we can take this step. And officially, they used the details are kind of complicated stuff, what actually happened. But the details of the summary is that on July 4th, 1776, they stated that they had officially approved a Declaration of Independence. And that's a big deal. It was Congress that made that decision. Not each state acted on their own. The states didn't act as states. Congress acted on behalf of all the states. And in that sense, Congress was acting as though the United States was a nation, and they were the government of that nation, making a major decision on what that nation was going to do. It's going to become a separate nation, independent of England. Now, I'd like to talk about the Declaration of Independence. It's such an important document in American history. I'd like to spend some time discussing that, and I can't do it today. Can't do it in this context. But I just point some things out about it. As you know, I hope you know that it was actually written by a committee of Congress, the way things normally do with organizations like Congress. They have committees, and then the committees make reports, and they have motions to approve it, and da-da-da. The Declaration of Independence was written by a committee with Thomas Jefferson as sort of the chair of the committee. And it was done by the full committee, and then the committee submitted their report, and Congress approved the report. They adopted it. They made some changes. But really it's the work of Thomas Jefferson. And remember, I talked about John Locke and his ideas about revolution. And I hinted at that time that maybe you might want to think about this, remember this, because we're going to be hearing about it again. It's obvious that Thomas Jefferson was very familiar with the work of John Locke. As an educated American, he would have had to have been. He had to know a lot about John Locke and his theories. And the Declaration of Independence is based on the theories of John Locke. All men are created equal. Well, that's how it starts. And that's a problem. Because if you know, we're talking here about a nation that's not based on all men, it's based on white male landowners, and then it's a country that includes women, and who are the men? Well, this phrase, all men are created equal, has perplexed and vexed Americans ever since July 4th, 1776. What does it mean? What did he mean by this? There are some historians, mostly women historians, female historians, who've tried to make Jefferson into some kind of an 18th century feminist, and to say that when he said men, he really meant humanity, that he meant all people, and that he was as much concerned about women and so forth as he was about males per se. And so people try to make him look good and say, okay, well, yeah, he said men, but he means all people by that. He really means everybody. I don't think that's right. I have to say, I think from everything that Jefferson wrote and everything else that he said at the time and everything else that was going on, he was using the phrase men in a literal sense. He meant literally the gender male people. That's who he meant, males. Now this is partly linked to the idea that Americans have always had about who constitutes the people. And they look on the male as sort of the head of the family. They look on him as the person who does the work, who takes care of his family, who looks out for everybody, takes care of his children. And so he's the one. That's why he votes. That's why only males vote. They're the protectors of their family. Now, this is not a very accurate view. There were a lot of female-headed families in those days. Women were much a part of the society as anybody else. But the view at the time was that only men counted. So sorry, Tom, you don't get it. You can't be a feminist. We can't make you into a real hero. You're just as bad as everybody else at that time. You thought only men counted. A more troublesome issue was, did he include African American males? And just as there are some feminists who want to make Jefferson into a feminist president, a feminist person, there are some African American historians, there are some liberal historians who want to make Jefferson an early day pioneer for civil rights, that he's this great hero who stood up for everybody, and he meant just by saying all men, he included men regardless of color. Well, again, I'm sorry to say, sorry, Tom, I can't go along with you. I think that you were just as much of a racist as everybody else in that time. So I have to take a break here for a little rewind on the clock or on the camera, and then I'll explain to you why.